Hello and welcome to another episode of Pakistanomy. My name is Uzair Yunus, and last week we covered a startup, Human Dash Healthcare, providing concierge services on the healthcare side, and that reminded me that we haven't talked about the broader startup ecosystem in Pakistan for a while now. And a lot has changed from last year when we covered this industry and ecosystem at length, talking to founders, talking to investors, getting a sense of the broader ecosystem itself. But then, like much of the economy and much of the rest of the world, the technology sector, particularly startups, have seen a dramatic decline in funding flows in terms of valuations, etc. Even red hot markets like India, for example, you've had companies like Ola reduce their valuations. You've had companies like Baiju's get into trouble. So there's a lot going on in this sector globally and in Pakistan as well. So I figured that we should talk about this topic and cover it. So joining me today is Mutaher Khan. Muthaher is a business and technology journalist based in Pakistan. He's also founder of Data Darbar, which is an excellent place and platform for getting information and insights about what's going on in the broader technology ecosystem in Pakistan. So I'm excited for this conversation. And Muthaher, welcome to Pakistanomy.
Thank you so much, Uzair, for having me. Love the work you guys are doing. So great to be here.
Well, thank you for that and love the work that you're doing as well because it's very insightful and keeps people like me informed about what's going on. So maybe inform the audience and start with that, right? A lot going on. As I mentioned, it was riding on a high for the last couple of years. 2023 has been a very tough period for the broader economy and the technology sector in particular as well, given higher interest rates globally, economic crisis in Pakistan, internet shutdowns, bans, etc. Give us an overview of what is going on right now. And as you follow this sector, what are some key events that in the last 7 months or so of 2023 have stood out to you that perhaps are important events that the audience should also know and understand?
I mean, there are a couple of things. It's so the first thing that we should take view of is that obviously Pakistan in 2021 and early parts of 2022, when there was still hangover from 2021, was in a different kind of high, as you mentioned, in terms of VC funding. And there was a lot of startup activity, specifically in VC funded startups. So, and as the markets changed gears, Pakistan changed gears more sharply than anyone else. So it's obviously the recalibration that we have seen across the globe. Pakistan was even worse compared to, I think, most markets. So that thing started becoming visible by third quarter of 2022 when funding was down significantly. By Q2 2022, we were still at 100 million odd a quarter, which is pretty good. Q1 2022 was 172 million or something. So again, that's a very healthy flow. But in the next 2 quarters and then in this quarter, the outgoing quarter of 2023, that's when things really nosedived and we reached like 5.2 million of funding, which is literally lower than what used to be average ticket size uh, 1 year ago. So that's how steep the recalibration has been in Pakistan. Uh, and part of the reason, obviously, for that has been the global pullback in VC asset class generally that's happened across the globe. Fundraising at the fund level has gone down significantly, especially at micro funds. So that was the kind of capital that was eventually being deployed in Pakistan, right? I'm not saying there was new funds were deploying in Pakistan, but it was usually the smaller micro funds, sub 50 million or 100 million or less, that you deploy in Pakistan. Those funds have seen a sharp adjustment. And obviously, Pakistan didn't take a back seat. So I think Q1, I didn't run the numbers for Q2, but Q1 was when Pakistan did not see, if I'm not mistaken, Pakistan did not see, or I think had saw one new foreign investor. Uh, Before that, it used to be like 23, 32. So that was the kind of activity that we used to see from foreign investors. And remember, foreign investors were the people were the only ones that were actually carrying the investment value. So Pakistani VCs were involved in terms of deal flow, but they did not have the capital, they did not have the dry powder to take us to 350 million or $360 million of VC funding in a year. Because if you sum up their entire fund sizes, they wouldn't add up to 60 million, $360 million. They wouldn't probably even add up to $100 million. So obviously they needed foreign investors to come in as anchor investors or as lead investors to really amp up the round sizes. And when those investors went away, A, because of obviously the global readjustment, B, because of the downhill that Pakistani economy went on. And at one point, obviously, you had a lot of chatter about default, and obviously that has just subsided, uh, literally a month ago, right? Uh, and that really changed the equation to Pakistan. I mean, why would anyone want to invest in a country that was attached with so much risk? And it makes sense from any asset class. And obviously, VC, as risky as it may be, no one wants to get into an economy that's on the brink of a default, which was the case with us. So that has been another reason. But if we zoom out a little bit, uh, then maybe, I mean, I think someone said this to me that obviously things in 2020, like things are when things are going well, it's like every boom suggests that things are going better than they are, and every bust suggests that things are worse than they actually are. So I think that applies to Pakistan as well. That applies to literally every cycle of business. When there's boom, uh, we know that that's not really a boom that's going to last, and when there's a bust, we know there are structural flaws, but things may not things the actual on ground picture may not present the readjustment. So I think that applies to the general macroeconomy, markets in general, and Pakistan specifically as well. So that was the case. 2023 has been obviously very slow in terms of VC funding, but there are a couple of things that have continued as they were. I'll give you one example. I think SCCP just released their a couple of weeks back. They released their company incorporation data. So Pakistan incorporated more companies in fiscal year 2023, meaning ending in June 2023, than they did in June 20, then in fiscal 2022, which was already higher than in fiscal 21 and higher than fiscal 20. So like in the past 4 years, we've seen more companies come online than we've seen in the entire before that, the 71 years of Pakistan. So it gives you an idea that there is a growing trend of entrepreneurship. If not VCs, there's a growing trend of company incorporation. And another thing is that obviously most of these companies, except for real estate, which is obviously an obsession for Pakistani businesses, but other than that, technology sector standalone has been the second largest sector. And if you club e-commerce with it, it actually comes out. I think it just edges out as the largest sector, if I'm not mistaken. So again, there's a strong technology focus or technology interest at the very least in every single entrepreneurial venture in Pakistan that's being undertaken. And the third thing that SCCP data points out is, I think Pakistan saw 841 foreign investments in FY23, which is usually that number was around 600, 500. So it's significantly higher than what it used to be in the previous year. Obviously, we don't unfortunately know the size of those investments. We just know that the number of companies that recorded foreign investment, that was 841. Uh, it's obviously there's still a long way to go, but again, it's sort of these are probably better indicators of the true pulse of corporate activity than the 100 odd companies that are in VC. Because at the end of the day, in terms of capital, obviously those companies, in terms of capital, in terms of uh, press attention, those companies occupy a significant share. But in actual employment generation, uh, those companies are probably not the biggest contributors. They are contributors, yes, but I mean, I think you can probably count on fingers the number of companies that have more than 1,000 people. in the VC funded space, like maybe three or four, five at best, right? That is not the case with IT services, where every single or every third office of Sharif SL might have like 300 people or 500 people or 700 people. That's the kind of scale these companies have, and I think they get missed out in the broader conversation when we talk about entrepreneurship or what's happening in the technology ecosystem, which is more than just VC funded. Unfortunately, obviously, we don't have anything more than we don't have any other sources of capital. That's the bigger problem. But generally, yeah, that's the overview in my view.
No, that's interesting, and I think the Securities and Exchange Commission of Pakistan (SECP's) data, as you described it, does point to the fact that while international money has stopped flowing, while economic prospects have dimmed, as you said, about the last month, there was a real risk of default. And maybe that risk of default hasn't gone away over the next 12 months, but for the time being, there's some respite, at least over the next 6 to 8 months, because of the IMF agreement. But you are right, we do miss the broader technology story, in the sense that, the IT services export houses are not considered entrepreneurs, or they're not considered technology, companies, in the sense that we think of when we talk about the startup ecosystem, although they are startups in my view, and I think you would agree. But on that side, and we'll get to that part of the
Yeah.
equation in just a moment, but on the VC funded side, right, we saw, and again, not unique to Pakistan, this froth in the market. You saw Airlift raising a lot of money. You saw every other, as you said, headlines about bigger and bigger rounds, and more excitement about funding coming in. But then things started to turn around. Airlift went belly up. There have been stories on Jugnu. There have been other startups that have sort of wrapped up operations. And much of the coverage has led to this, conversation about the fact that, oh, the media is creating negative stories. One, I would love for you to comment on that, but more importantly, what happened with these sort of like big story startups, and what are the key drivers from your point of view that led to the dramatic super high valuation and then going bust all of a sudden?
So, I think there's the first thing. I mean, I don't want to become like told you so guy, but obviously there was always a real risk of Pakistan's own macros uh, spoiling the party. Regardless of what happened in the international market, any company that was operating in Pakistan, uh, if it commanded a valuation of $300 million or $250 million in 2 years, I mean that without any serious cash flow and just based on the basis of GMV, then obviously, uh, I mean, in the end of the day, at the end of the day, you obviously can argue that valuation is what two parties agree to, sure. But I'm talking about valuations that have any real chance of being exercised, right? So those were not the valuations that could ever be exercised in Pakistan. I think it has not been being pessimistic. This is me having seen enough of the market that it doesn't make sense, right? System is a good example. I think System is trading at what 123 billion PKR or something. Uh, so it's a pretty cheap company compared to its valuation. I think is either just above or just below one of the big short startups. So uh, and Systems obviously has like operating margins of 18, 19%, and then you have the exchange rate gains and whatnot. Uh, so this then you contrast it with the valuations that these startups had. Generally, even in the developed markets, they were subject to, I mean, you can call it the pump and dump that was happening in the private markets, right? You buy X at X percent at uh, you buy X percent at Y dollars, and then you try to sell that X percent at 20Y in a matter of 10 months. On paper. You can command a great valuation. You can do even like a good secondary. Uh, but again, that requires a good liquid market, which unfortunately Pakistan does not have or did not have either at the time. So, and obviously, the entire companies being acquired or going public was not an option. at least again, going public requires a certain scale, a certain unit economics, a certain level of transparency that obviously was too early and is still too early for a lot of product-based companies. Uh, and in terms of acquisition, Pakistan just doesn't have the M&A market, not at the moment, that anyone can come in and buy, let's say, an $80 million company, uh, $80 million company at, let's say, Series A. So that was the kind of problem that Pakistan was always going to have, regardless of what happened in the fundraising environment. The only hope was that the international investors will keep pumping money for the follow-on rounds from pre-Series A to Series A to Series B and Series C. But even then, there was some question mark. For example, Airlift's founder pointed it out as well, and I remember having this conversation earlier in 2021 when they raised the money with a friend, that when you take $85 million and you put it together, you break it down by investors. So the number of institutions they had was, I think, three, or at least public three or four. Uh, Putting together $85 million through high net worth individuals is a tremendous feat in terms of raising capital. But it does point to certain cracks in what will happen when you go for a $300 million round, because maybe you can scrape together 85 million through high net worths, but it becomes almost impossible to do that for $300 million.
But so
Uh,
let's get into the airlift saga, right? A lot of money was raised, and then they
hmm,
made a pivot in the pandemic, going from a
hmm,
more like a mobility company to into commerce and into quick service delivery essentially. And my
hmm,
question, again, sitting from the outside, was looking at the business and asking myself the question: A, what's the target market here? And the target market for somebody who can afford, or would desire a 15-10 minute quick service delivery or 30-minute delivery across Pakistan, even in a big city like Karachi, is a very small segment of the
yeah.
population. Then I asked myself the question, okay, that segment of the population, which is, let's say, more skewed towards the top 5% or 1% of income earners as households, are likely to have the household help that can do the 15 service delivery for them, right? Your chowkidar, your driver, your
Yeah,
gardener, your
absolutely.
chotu, whatever, right? So you can send somebody to the corner store if you want milk in 10 minutes, right? So it always was a question in terms of how much you can do that. But then, of course, we see from the global example, you can grow GMV a lot through deep discounting, which
Yeah.
is a fair strategy. Flipkart has done it. It got bought out for $17 billion by Walmart, who has continued to invest in that. And there's a strategy behind that. It makes sense. And your point on the macro story is valid. But operationally, what
Hmm.
happened at Airlift? Because there's been a lot of conversation on it. And I just want you to sort of, in sort of a top line way, explain to the audience what exactly went wrong
I mean, I
from
mean,
there.
generally, obviously, what went wrong was that when GMV became the key target for any startup to achieve, right? And Pakistan is a very difficult market to get GMV. I mean, I mean, I'm not saying that it's easy to get a huge GMV in any market, but Pakistan is a particularly difficult market, especially when you're talking about consumer segment, right? Because you need to get enough volumes to get that GMV. Let's say if you're talking about 100 million GMV, or if you're talking 50 million, that requires significant volumes, because obviously the average order size is going to be very small in Pakistan, and uh, that will always be the case within any emerging market for that matter. Pakistan probably even more so, given our economy in the last 5 years. I mean, there's a serious contraction in purchasing power that I think pretty much everyone would have noticed, right? Uh, and now you're coming at that market, and you need to show the GMV to investors in order to keep raising more. And uh, so what you do is that you go for a couple of things. What Airlift did was they started discounting high value items. For example, at one point they were selling iPhones for like 6 to 7,000 rupees discount or something. So I mean, in percentage terms, it's let's say on 200, let's say 200,000, 200,000 rupees iPhone they were selling at 193. So I mean, percentage that's not a lot, but in value that's a significant discount because I mean you don't you don't give let's say a 5% discount on cars generally. That's you on cars the discount is you add value, you give value added service of servicing or whatever, right? That's the kind of stuff. So just straight away giving booking those losses on inventory, it's a huge risk, and obviously after a point you burn cash to do that. And in order to keep doing that, you need more inflows of cash. Unfortunately, that's when the cash stopped. So everyone was burning cash in the hope that there will be more cash coming in the next 6 months or in the next 12 months. And then after after they had spent most of their cash, which was what happened with the lift, which was what happened with Jugnu, that the cash stopped coming. For Jugnu's case, in Jugnu's case, for example, the investor, which made an investment last year, reportedly backed out, and they only gave them half of the 22 million promised. So every uh, planning, every business forecasting was done on the basis of those 22 million, let's say, and now you have only 11 million. And Airlift's case, I think, as far as I know, the money came in, all the money came in, so it wasn't a case of existing investors backing out, but it was the case of around falling through, right? They were believed to be they were believed to have actually closed a 300 million, 350 million dollar round from GoPuffs. And that round, again, this was reportedly a very credible claim. Again, I haven't seen any documents, so I can't comment on the veracity, but it was believed to be a 300 million, could be a strategic acquisition. And then that 300 million plug is pulled within a day, and obviously you can't do anything. And then obviously, when one investor backs out and there's a change in the model, and this is group of was doing exactly or similar to what Airlift was doing in Pakistan, right? And then group of I think laid off 40% staff in December 2021, if I'm not mistaken. This was around the time when Airlift conversation was happening as well. And then they pull out. They or reportedly they pull out again. I don't want to claim any ownership of these facts. I'm basing it on what I've read, what I've heard from fairly credible sources. Yes, but again, no factual evidence that I put that I possess. Uh, and investors, not just with respect to Pakistan, but investors start questioning the model itself, because when the poster boys of that model in the US start pulling back, then the investors of similar companies uh, think think about these things as well. Okay, why didn't they do it? If they had 10x the money or 20x the money that Airlift did, why couldn't they pull it off, right? How much money would we need to inject in XYZ company for it to get to that point? So these were the questions I think with Airlift that, and from purely operational perspective, obviously, if there was a culture of, I mean, generally in VC startups, when you have the money taps open, then it reflects in the way you spend. I mean, it's very difficult to not. I mean, there would be hardly any founders, or at least founders with teams of more than 20 people that would be very conservative with spending if they have venture capital. It's not just
The
meant to be
whole
like
the
that,
whole
right?
idea is to spend to grow. Yeah.
Exactly, right, exactly. So, and a lot of back in the day, a lot of founders saw an opportunity and they capitalized on that because it was the first time that actually meaningful capital was available in Pakistan to someone who did not ever could even imagine having access to that. So if let's say a graduate of 2015 with 5 years of experience could now raise $6 million, $7 million, having entirely worked in Pakistan their entire lives, right? That was never imagined. I mean, you could never say that, okay, someone, let's say, I graduated in 27, let's say if I'm going to raise money, pre-2020, I think no one my age could have imagined that you could go out and market and even imagine about raising 2 billion rupees or 1 billion rupees. That's a number that you just read in news. That's not a number that has any relevance to you in your personal life, right? That's an abstract number, but that number became real and possible for not again not a majority of people, but again that dream became possible. So and in order to attain that dream, there was certain playbook that you had to play. Uh, Whether it worked out for founders or not, I don't think it particularly did. But at the moment, you knew what the criteria was in order to get to that dream. It was to show investors a certain promise of digitizing a country of 220 million with X million internet users and Y% young population. And there was a clear pitch which was replicated across the board. And it's sold. Like investors bought it. It's as simple as that. I mean, I'm no one to have any questions about it. Like if the investors were happy with putting their money and the founders were smart to uh, press investors on what worked for them. So I think it worked at the time. But obviously, uh, from a founder's perspective, if that that first $5 million round, the first 10 million was always supposed to be the first of many rounds. It was never meant to be 5 million. Was not it. Because if you're going with the intention of burning for the next 3 years, you with the same way that you might be hiring, like there would be startups who would be hiring in Europe for certain roles that were difficult to uh, scout for in Pakistan. So obviously, when you're hiring in Europe or when you're going abroad, uh, then you cannot just have. You need to have those pockets as well, and you need to have those budgets as well. And unfortunately, those budgets stopped for those investors. And for some, well, the ones who are still surviving, uh, they pivoted in some form or the other, or they significantly cut back on their expenses, either by downsizing or almost entirely cutting the marketing spend. There are a couple of cases which like, their startups are literally pulled the plug on marketing spend. Hardly any. They're just waiting for this cycle to be over that they can start spending at a time when there is a potential return on ad spend, right? And then you can show some benchmarks, some KPIs to the investors to raise a further round. At the moment, I think everyone feels that any money they spend mm, would be a wasted dollar. So I think that's the general perception that I get.
And related to that, so what's been the impact on the job market, right? Again, as you said, they were trying to find it difficult to get talent and going to Europe for certain roles, etc. I heard stories about, people being outbid, get an offer. And this was again a global phenomenon through the
Yeah.
pandemic. It was in the US, it was in India. You heard in Europe the same story, parts of East Asia, Africa, the same issue. That hey, Muthaher joins Uzair's startup, Uzair makes him a plus 20% market rate offered. 3 months later, the next round, the competitor or some other company that Muthaher gets a plus 50% from that, and you're gone. And now I'm trying to outbid somebody else to get the other Muthaher in my team, right? But now the funding's not there. So what are you seeing, hearing in terms of like the recruiting cycle for talent at these startups? Like what's going on over there?
And that's almost like it's almost dead in a way. So I mean, there are certain functions that the startups are still hiring for, but that war seems to be over. Everyone is trying to retain that talent, and obviously that everyone was trying to retain that talent every single point, regardless of the funding. But but we have to, I think we have to zoom out for a second because when we talk about that particular talent market, that was a very small niche in the market. Because again, as I mentioned, there are 80 like in 2021, I think there were 82 startups that raised funding. Now you're talking about 80 companies. I mean, again, not all 80 of them would be fighting for the talent. It would probably be the 15 of them that would be fight, 15, 20, let's say. 25% of the companies that had raised money would probably be fighting for that talent. Uh, it would be the airlifts and the bazaars and the retailers, right? Because they had enough
What would
capital
you say
to
is the average size of these 80? I would say roughly, let's assume each one on average is for 50 people, high estimate. That's 4,000
and
people
like,
writ large in that
yeah,
ecosystem,
yeah,
right?
yeah, exactly. So it's a very small base. And again, and I think it was generally that bidding war was mostly around like three, four universities. Uh, I don't think that a lot of others, at least from the relatively younger batch of talent, were particular beneficiaries of that. Obviously, you had the Lums and the IBAs and the GKs and NAS probably benefiting from that, but you couldn't hear maybe let's say Ikra University student or Karachi University student particularly uh, being in on that radar.
They're
So
not
that
getting
that
poached for 50% of a market price.
yeah, I don't think I think it applied to a very small subset, and that is generally vocal on internet. So I think that that subset there was a clear obviously there's no denying that that particular subset witnessed you can, I mean, I don't want to use word unprecedented, but whatever the closest would be, a spike in salaries, right? Especially if you're technical. I know someone, not necessarily, obviously there was a global phenomenon, like there were global pressures as well. Obviously, that let's say I'm a technical guy, and I'm currently at a software house at let's say 100K with 3 years of experience or 2 years of experience, which was the normal case, right? And now there's a funded startup that is offering mid to 50K. Again, very common in during those days. But what happens next is that uh, a global company offers me $3,000. Now startups were also outbid by global competitors. So they were not just competing against, it was very easy to compete against local software houses. You just need to pay like a relatively decent salary uh, and and not be exploitative. I mean, that benchmark was very low. But when you go against the global company, especially the remote talent culture that developed during that time, then it becomes difficult to retain that talent because again, if you're a technical person, then I think even if you're not good, getting a job is not a problem. So even probably the worst talent get worst technical resources can get jobs that the rest of the human capital in Pakistan could even dream of. Uh, Primarily because of the exchange rate, but also because there is a real crunch for technical resources everywhere. Whether it's perceived or it's real, I think it's very real. But like even if we can debate about how good the quality is or not, but quality comes a little later for most of the times. First of all, you need to get your hands on someone and then think about how good the work is. So I think that was there were a couple of factors, but obviously since then that has changed from a local funded ecosystem. That global pressure is still there and probably even higher because obviously the exchange rate has gone down what 80%, 85% since in the last 12 months alone. So you are talking about even if those 80 companies do not have the funds or those 25% of the 80 companies do not have the funds to do poaching wars and whatnot, the global companies have enough capital to pay $700 uh, to a Pakistani guy and basically get everything they want. Uh, 12 hours job for $700. That's a dream
Yeah,
deal for a
and I
Pakistani guy.
would even add that they could, they probably, the global ones have more pressure to do that because they also have to cut costs now. So they're also thinking
Exactly.
about finding cheaper pools of talent that is good enough for the time being.
Exactly. So I think that part, that pressure still stays on the ecosystem, but that pressure was never something that the ecosystem could have dealt with, right? Uh, I mean, whatever company it is in Pakistan, at the end of the day, almost every company would like to pay in rupees. Because if their revenue comes in rupees, then it would be idiotic to not pay in rupees. As as feel good as it may seem to pay in dollars, if your revenue is coming, then obviously, unless you have investor taps open, then obviously it's a different equation. But so no company in Pakistan in their right mind would be or no local market focused company in their right mind would ever pay salaries in dollars, right? Or peg to dollars. Uh, and that market is still there. And now they have even three people company who couldn't previously imagine hiring the resource abroad can now easily do, and they just need to pay $300, and they'll not only get it, some of the best university graduates in Pakistan. I mean, I think you can go to some of the top universities in Pakistan, and you can see that a lot of their freshers are now going for basic clerical remote jobs in the US or elsewhere, because obviously pay wise start they start out at like a 60% higher rate or compared to local company. So even if that may have even if that may harm your career in the longer run, let's say, because you're not doing something uh, that has a lot of room for growth, in the short run, that payout is very significant for anyone to say no. Let's say a local company is hiring me as a fresher for 100,000, and the other company is paying me $500. $500 is still peanuts for any global company, and I know even if I leave them, I can probably get for another $600. And not only am I protecting myself, I'm getting a far higher salary, and I'm getting a 60% almost higher salary compared to me. So that phenomenon
And
is
you're
playing out.
guarded against inflation, which is the most
Exactly.
important problem right now.
Exactly. Exactly. So I think that again, no one can really, no one can really fight that. And in terms of, I think the bigger, I'll just add on the IT outsourcing side, which used to be the main supplier of talent. Uh, this problem still exists, right? Uh, because those were the companies that primarily recruited most of the talent. Because again, you could maybe 4,000, 5,000 people would probably work in the startup ecosystem, and 5,000 people would work in systems alone. And then maybe 2,510 pearls or something, whatever the numbers may be. So two companies or one IT company is generally bigger than all startups combined at the moment as well, at least. So their demand for talent would be far higher, and they are still struggling to fill those roles, especially for senior roles. Maybe not for product because they don't build products, but they are struggling for solution architects. They are struggling for, I know companies, even product companies, like seriously struggling for head of engineering uh, because you don't have, especially even companies that have a back office in Pakistan and selling in the US market. It's I knew one company that was struggling to, I think they tried to hire a head of engineering for a year uh, because no one really had the experience of selling to the US market and serving hundreds of thousands of users and building the architecture for that, managing the architecture for that. So I think that's a big challenge in Pakistan, especially as you go up the seniority ladder. That talent is not there, and obviously that talent will develop in time. Uh, either we import that talent or we train that talent. There is no other source of talent. It's not going to come from the skies, right?
Yeah, no, I think that is consistent with, I mean, across the board. One thing that, again, it's very easy to engage in sloganeering and say Pakistan has amazing human capital and is cheap and the exchange rate and blah blah blah. But what you said, I've heard this from almost every startup or technology company. Not even that. I mean, last week I spoke with Dr. Atif, and he was saying that it took him and his team 400 interviews to hire one nurse in Pakistan, right? Just because, and they were like, we're willing to pay above market rates, and we just could not find the right talent at the skill set we wanted. even in the nurse area, because the quality was not good enough, right? And again, the reason why I think, I mean, you can find nurses in Pakistan, but if you're trying to provide a concierge like service to your customers and charge a premium for it, and you're willing to pay a premium salary, then you want premium talent. And that is where the problem lies in the country across the board. And I think, again, those who sort of talk about this amazing human capital story need to understand that, yes, the quantity is there, but the quality needs to be built up significantly. Another question I had, obviously, if you project into the future, 12 to 18 months, let's say, what are some things you're watching? Again, before we hit recording, I was talking to you about this. It's something I've written about myself. There are a lot of laws on the docket, and probably by the time this episode goes live on YouTube, there might be an e-safety bill passed, because the way Parliament is passing legislation, it's fast food legislation. They've passed the Official Secret Act amendment today. There's a data protection bill that's on the docket. I've read that, and I've talked to people, industry, civil society, etc. Everyone's really concerned about these bills that are there. So, one, share a bit about your own thoughts at this point in time about these legislation coming in, but more importantly, where do you see things going in the next year or so?
On legislation, I have like generally, uh, I've never considered myself to be. I've never considered myself to be a libertarian in that respect. That I'm all for regulation if it's done properly, right? But but I think Pakistani policymakers, Pakistani regulators have two modes. They have a hyperactivity and a hypoactivity mode, right? So in hyperactivity, you have the clear case of what was happening with the loan sharks, digital loan sharks recently. Uh, Complaints were being brought forward every day. There were the topic was raised by media multiple times by us, like at least like I personally wrote about like four or five times over a year. So again, it was, and there were like slight slaps
And sorry to
just
interrupt you
to
here. This is it's a good point you raise on this point, because I remember people like you, others on social media writing about it, agitating on this for months. And if I remember the timeline correctly, at least in the last wave, the India story on loan
mm,
sharks broke much after the Pakistani one. And the Indians took action
yeah,
much, much, much
yeah,
faster on these and clamping down on this. Then the SECP, in fact, there was a lot of
yeah,
noise on social media saying, look what Delhi is doing. Can't you just
yeah,
replicate what their action plan is? Because this is leading to suicides, right? This is
yeah,
physical. This is not just monetary harm, which is criminal
yeah,
in
exactly.
itself. People were dying as a result of this.
Exactly. So I mean, regulators have this mode, right? So if there's something, I mean, it may not necessarily be a case of lobby. Even it could be a case. I mean, given it's Pakistani regulators, it could be a case of like complete lethargy for like again. I'm just guessing. I think there's something wrong with the corridors of
ऊपर से
government
ऑर्डर
buildings,
नहीं
Islamabad.
आया ऊपर से ऑर्डर नहीं आया
And the second mode is they get hyper focused on a particular regulation. And I think my theory is that, uh, especially with respect to tech and businesses, a lot of our regulators, they're old school fellas, so they read paper in the morning and they'll read upon, okay, EU did this, EU passed this particular regulation, and US is bringing this particular regulation.
India
So,
is their
okay,
favorite.
what can we, right, what can we do now? So I think like the best example to signify this was, I think, in 2021 when the markets were red hot. SPAC activity was through the roof. Securities and Exchange Commission of Pakistan published a draft framework for SPAC. And now we are a market that does not even get regular listings, but somehow we needed a framework for SPAC. And obviously nothing
I
came
think
out.
2 weeks ago the State Bank issued a note on use of AI, because that's the new thing right now everywhere. So
If you remember the CBDC thing, Rada Bakr left out this uh, I don't know what to shosha would be the only word that can probably describe it. that we are studying CBDC. I mean, they can't even figure out publishing basic data, let alone they can't even upload their entire data on easy data for at the moment. So I mean, forget publishing new data sets. But obviously, then we
Well,
are supposed
you're
to.
far ahead of me. I to just say that at least publish whatever your research department is working on as working papers for the rest of us human beings to study what exactly you are researching at this point in time.
Yeah, I don't think they believe in those takallufas. But so this is what happens with regulation, right? So I think data bill, like again, data bill is due. Like there is no doubt about that. I remember very clearly. I started. I entered this industry. I entered this field. Like started following tech back in 2018, and right around that time, like I think the same month, uh, the first draft of the data protection bill was uh, tabled. Uh, I read that bill. I remember then the 2020 bill came, and then 2021, and now it's 2023.
Let me ask you a question since you raised this, because this is a question I have and I know the answer to this, but I'll just indulge me for a moment. 2018, May, this bill first draft came out, as you said. It's been 5 years. Do you know who the authors of this bill are?
No, no. So I think it's probably a consultant based out of Islamabad that started researching about data privacy right after they won the contract. I think this is what happens with most Islamabad-based consulting projects. Uh, there's something seriously wrong with the way work is done in
That's
that
why I asked
city.
this question. Like, can you imagine that it's been 5 years and a bill has been drafted, and its latest draft, by the way, I think I was speaking with people that's online. People are not fully sure if that's the latest draft, number one, but let's ignore that for a moment because that's par for the course. People do not know who the authors of this bill are. And typically it's written in a committee in parliament. That's the process. I
Yeah.
cannot find a parliamentarian who is willing to come on this podcast and say, boss, I am the lead author. Let me explain to you my logic for inserting certain sections. I cannot find anybody.
I'll, I'll actually be a little, I'll be a little more generous with respect to data bill because again, they've more or less copied what the general standards are from a regulator's perspective. And obviously, that debate of what the regulators want, what versus what the businesses want, that divide is always going to be there. So in terms of that, I don't think it's a particularly great work of again, but it's at the end of the day, it's meant to be a bill. So it's never it's not a policy as such. It's always going to be. It was a very boring read, so obviously. So, but they tried to follow the general blueprints on what qualifies as a from a regulator's perspective, what qualifies as a good bill, right? So I think in a lot of senses they simply followed what the EU did. Like they kept GDPR as the benchmark and then revolved everything around that and then took a bit from Turkey or took a bit from India. And that's generally a lot of regulation is done across the board, I think, for every sector. But on regulation, something not too long ago, Ministry of IT published its national AI policy, which was a pretty, on this point, it was a pretty funny exercise because they like there are a couple of instances like in that policy like they talk about uh, oh Pakistan suffers from they were talking about particular use cases where AI policy will come in and they were talking about digitization of health data and how that can be utilized to train models that are specific to Pakistan and obviously that's a great idea and it should be done absolutely but they talk about okay many people suffer from chronic diseases. I mean, only if there were published numbers of how many people die from those chronic diseases in Pakistan. It's that data is literally published by the PBS. You just have to go and open that document once. You don't have to do that a lot. And then it talks about about publications in AI journals. And surprisingly, Pakistan doesn't do too bad on AI publications. Like it was, I was looking at the data. OECD had a library on this AI publication. So Pakistan is in a fairly decent place. Uh, and again, if you look at patents, generally, obviously, patents are not specific to AI. In AI, actually, patents may be even more difficult to obtain, especially for a Pakistani company, because we don't do cutting edge work in terms of R&D. That kind of money that requires, we don't have that, unfortunately. But
I think
Pakistan,
I think you need about 8 or 9 or whatever the insanely high count is of permits to import a 3D printer in Pakistan. So
exactly.
there's all sorts
So
of curbs.
exactly. So I mean, basic. I mean, even purchasing basic hardware, basic like a decent laptop is becoming a challenge for universities, businesses, and everyone. So I mean, forget cutting about Pakistan is doesn't again compared to similar markets, which I generally consider Egypt, Bangladesh, Indonesia. They are ahead of us, but again, more or less in the same league, at least more compared to India. So again, don't do that bad. And that data is available. For example, on AI publications or generally on publications, HEC publishes that data. Publications by each category as per HEC universities. So only if that they could use that data and uh, use that data to guide the policy. Instead, what we had random targets that by 2027, Pakistan will train 1 million people in AI. Now, where that 1 million is coming from, I have absolutely no idea, because if our talent inflow or the IT graduates per year is around 25 to 30,000 as per industry sources, uh, then how do you get to 1 million? I mean, even if you train every single existing person on AI, which is obviously not happening, and you train every single new person, even then we might not reach
But
1 million.
it's
So
Mutahed
that's the
that
kind of goals they.
it's the same logic as, like, every announcement that's made ahead of elections in a speech इस डिस्ट्रिक्ट में यूनिवर्सिटी खोल देंगे. भाई आप यूनिवर्सिटी खोल दोगे, प्रोफेसर कहाँ से लाओगे? Professor nahi hai. We don't have enough PhDs for the existing universities. Why are you building new ones, right? So that's always the question. But coming back to the ecosystem itself, you talked about legislation. Like, what's your outlook? Where do you see things going? As you said at the start of this podcast, incorporation is happening. Companies are being founded. Businesses are opening up. There is a cultural shift on entrepreneurship. So, what's your realistic take on what comes next and where things go from here?
I think generally what I think would be next is specifically within the tech. Uh, I think there's after this after this entire long episode of economic uncertainty. Generally, at least from again, I happen to speak to a lot of people who happen to do businesses, right? And maybe my circle is very biased in terms of that, but I see a real change in approach of what to do next. I think everyone, okay, no one really had uh, any particular trust in the state institutions to bring about a meaningful change, especially with respect to economy or for that or anything for that matter. So there has always been a serious trust deficit in Pakistani public, right? But and in business as well. That is why a lot of them make every single possible contingency plan. So if you're setting a factory, you will have like 2 to 3 sources of power. You might even put your independent power, and then you might even go for solar for like if you're a small business.
Very efficient way of running a business. In fact, like
Right?
I
I mean,
remember talking to a business owner who has a franchise of fast casual restaurants, and I met him like a couple of years ago, even before this crisis began. And I was like, "How's business doing? Are you willing to thinking of expanding more? What's the outlook?" And he was like, "Yeah, I want to expand. I have a desire to go national in a big way." But he's like, do you want to know what I'm struggling with right now? I'm like, what? He's like, my goal right now is to sink my capex that would have gone into expanding my franchises into converting my kitchens from natural gas to cylinders because there's no gas. And I was like, what a waste of potential, right? You are
exactly.
entrepreneurs who want to scale and create more jobs, are having to troubleshoot simply because the sarkar has failed to provide natural gas to them.
Essentially, you're down to dealing with municipal issues. Like uh, there are issues with footpath. Okay, you have this much inch extra on footpath, or you have your seats, and then they'll go and take away your tables. Uh, and obviously there's bribery at every stage. So there's a lot of firefighting that these businesses in particular, more than tech companies are, I think, still very much insular to an extent, very much insular from these developments. And because again, if you're a service company, if you're a pure service company, you don't have to deal with this kind of government thuggery that a customer facing company might have to, right?
Except
But
when they
generally,
decide to turn off the internet, then you're screwed.
yeah, of course. But I mean, that was also one of the like serious blows, right? But generally, what I've seen is that okay, Pakistani companies have come to the realization, even the rent-seeking ones, that okay, they can keep collecting the rents if they want, but if they really want to protect themselves from serious economic, I don't know, collapse, then the only way is to have assets abroad. I mean, either you would liquidate your assets in Pakistan and go, I don't know, buy property in Dubai and Portugal or somewhere, and then just move your just move to those countries and try for a citizenship or get an investment visa or whatever. But the others, they are trying to come up with ways, or they are looking to partner with people be who might be able to set up businesses abroad, for example, especially in IT services. There's a growing trend. I think recently, today I saw the ICAP was organizing this a seminar, a session on export of accounting services, for example. Again, it's a very low-hanging fruit for Pakistan, given that we have more than enough accounting talent, and our accounting talent is already well placed across the globe. Our accountants are every single at every single place across the globe, and they're at every single place of importance in Pakistan as well, right? So from K Electric to I don't know, even systems like
FBR के chairman भी
FBR,
account.
right? Exactly. So हर ऐसी जगह पे उन्होंने बिठाए हुए हैं अपने ICAP lobby is very strong. So but and that there's an export potential, right? And that export potential until now haven't really been realized. And it's a low hanging fruit. You don't have to build like $100 million company or something. You just have to build. You can easily bring in like 100, 200 collectively. Then it can add 100, $200 million of export revenue in 2, 3 years per year, right? That's a serious question for Pakistan. That's $200 million is not much generally in the grand scheme of things, but for Pakistan, it's a reasonable question. Similarly, for consulting, again, obviously we have a far smaller talent pool of consultants compared to accountants. But again, it's generally a low-hanging fruit that you don't need huge teams. You can do sales from the main offices from developed markets, and then assign that work to the back office in Pakistan. And I think that realization uh, has set in, and businesses, I don't know if they are able to do anything or not, because doing this would require spending some money. There would be some cost to it. There's a cost to business development. There's a cost to building that infrastructure. There's a cost to, and if you're doing remote work, essentially, there's a cost for that talent as well, because that talent can, at the end of the day, join competing companies. They will always go for competing companies, because if you've already done work for the US market, if not for a US company, then it becomes easier for you to work for a US company next, and that retention, that churn rate always comes with a cost for companies. So there'll have to be investments. Whether the local states or local businesses are ready for that, obviously we don't know, but at least they are accepting, okay, the status quo cannot work. And I think I've seen that. I was having a conversation with someone whose family is in the textile business, I think this was back in February, and this was around the time when basically all factories were uh, shut because their raw materials weren't being sourced or they were stuck at the containers. And he was telling me that, okay, we have everything, but we don't have the buttons. Then, okay, why don't you make buttons? It's not that difficult. And it was very easy to make buttons, but why would you make buttons when you can import them for like 20 cents of that cost, right? So there was no business sense to importing buttons. And now we are willing to invest that money into making buttons for the entire industry, even at a higher cost. But we cannot import machinery to set that up.
Yeah, yeah.
And so a lot of things, I mean, again, businesses, I think I do believe that businesses did contribute to certain things, but no one could have imagined that things will get to the point they did, especially in July 2022 when there was hardly any imports being allowed. So it was a very scary situation at the time for business, and I think that eroded much of the confidence, which seem going by the last month of market performance seems to be a relic of the past. But at the
Well,
time, it seemed like, okay, this shit's real, right? But I don't know. Again, markets show exuberance way more enthusiastically
as
than
our
the
dear
on-ground
friend,
reality.
as our dear friend Ariba Shahid says, the PSX is not an indicator of the economy. I will, before she yells at me for this point, I will say that over here. Muthaher, this has been a wonderful conversation, and as
Likewise.
always, wonderful reading your research and keeping tabs on what you're following and commenting on. So appreciate the insights. Before I let you go, I always ask my guests this. So, what are 2 or 3 books you would recommend to the audience?
So, okay, I one would be what this book generally. I really like that book. It was part of also my uh, me shunning my nationalistic era and then moving to uh, I don't know what era, but India Wins Freedom by Abul Kalam Azad. I really loved that book. I loved that book when I last read. It's been some time. Uh, I read that as a kid, so but it helped me shape the way I see history. So I think that was a very fun. Then obviously Peter Obon's Cornered Tiger on the history of Pakistan cricket, and that's again, I'm a huge Pakistan cricket fanatic, so uh, reading about the likes of Kardar and Hanif Mohammed, like it's a very different experience. And I think the third would be completely different, but Patras Bokhari ke Mazameen, again one of the best displays of satire and humor that has ever been published in any language. At least मेरे मुझे दो ही आती है तो उसमें तो
Hmm.
I would say.
Yeah. But speaking of corner tigers, what's your view on the new style of play by Team Pakistan that they
I,
demonstrated in Sri
I,
Lanka?
I, I had been waiting for it for a long, long time. Again, I think this was the last showed glimpses of it. Like I remember this conversation happening back in 2015 World Cup when Sarfaraz was brought in place of Nasir Jamshed, that he'll start playing attacking cricket, and the same conversation uh, was reproduced in 2017 Champions Trophy when Fakhar was brought in place of Ahmed Shahzad, and it gave us results as well. So I think that approach has worked, and I'm fairly confident. I mean, again, in this series, it worked. So I don't see any reason why we should play as, I don't know, kids that have a gun to their heads, that they need to stay by the day. I mean, it doesn't matter. I mean, personally, Pakistan, even at least in ODIs, I remember the two contrasting. It was in 2015 World Cup. Pakistan's average score used to be around 235, 240. Uh, and no matter what we played 50 overs, the score was the same. We played 30 overs, 40 overs, the score stayed the same. And in one match, on the other hand, West Indies conceded. New Zealand scored like 400 odd runs. Guptill scored 237, I think, not out against West Indies. And West Indies tried to go for it from ball one. And they scored 250 runs, 30 overs all out. So basically, in 30 overs, they got to the same score that we did by like with the slow poison that our team was that okay, we have to play 50
पूरे
overs and
50
then
खेलने
lose.
हैं.
पर 50 ओवर में खेल के हार के कोई इज्जत नहीं है. It's still as big. Okay, in World Cups you might have to move here and a bit here and there for net run rate, but generally there is no lesser disrespect in losing after playing 50 overs compared to 40 overs if
Yeah,
you play
yeah,
good
yeah.
cricket, right? So I think I'm a huge fan. Like again, I'm really optimistic. Again, I'm not optimistic. Sorry, I'm really hopeful, or I'm really wishful that they'll continue this brand of cricket uh, and in the World Cup and in the Asia Cups. Yeah.
Fingers crossed on that, and I'm hopeful as well. And again, great chatting with you. We'll have you on again soon, and in the
Likewise,
meantime,
there.
keep up the great work. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, there. Thank you. Hafiz.